the years, I've had some absolutely extraordinary, kind of unusual friends. You might even say peculiar. I don't mean that in an insulting way, but I've had some very interesting friends. One of my friends was an absolute genius mathematician. Now, I think sometimes the word genius gets sometimes misused, doesn't it? It gets thrown around, but he truly was a genius mathematician. And he never had to consciously add up any numbers at all. Never. If you asked him any sum, he would just tell you the answer. He wouldn't really have to think about it. He wouldn't really have to work it out. He would just tell you the answer. And he was never really wrong. He would just kind of know the answer. I mean, I can't describe it because I have to be honest, I've never experienced this myself. I'm in no danger of being a mathematical genius. But when he was first at university, he was so brilliant that he actually received a call from Harvard saying, will you come and study with us? We will pay your tuition, we will pay your accommodation, we will pay all your costs just for the prestige of having you come and study with us. He actually said no, which I've never quite understood. But anyway, one day I said to him, well, how do you do it? And he said, well, I can't really explain it to you, but when I see a sum or when I hear a sum, I see this whole series of colours. And then each colour represents a number, and then I just kind of read the colours, and out comes the answer, and it's always right. I mean, I can't. He said, this is the best way I can explain it to you. But he was one of my peculiar friends. Another of my friends, when I was at school, I think when we were 16 or 17, he turned out to be the most incredible computer program I've ever come across. And I'm sure there are other people like him. But when he was at school, I think when he was about 15, he was approached by a very prestigious IT company, and they said to him, if you will sign a contract before you're 17, as in whilst you're 16, we will guarantee you an incredible starting salary. There's no point going to university, just come and work for us. At the age of 15, they approached him. He was that good. He was in my computing class, and quite honestly, I don't know why, because there's really nothing that the teachers could teach him, but he was amazing. So I've had some really interesting friends. I know some really interesting people. The reason I mention those is that this week the Lord really reminded me of a friend of mine called Derek. He's a really great guy. He was somebody who came to our church about 10 or 11 years ago in the UK. And at the time, he didn't know the Lord. He led a really interesting life. He was kind of a special forces kind of soldier, one of these guys you wouldn't want to upset. And he came to our church, and there was always this kind of spiritual battle going on in his life. I have to say now he knows and loves Jesus, and it's really exciting. His life's been changed. But one of the first times he came to church, I had just bought my first guitar. It wasn't very fantastic. And I think I'd learned about 2 chords. And he said to me, oh, so you play the guitar? I said, well, not exactly. I've just bought this and I'm just learning. He said, oh, I used to play the guitar. I haven't picked it up for, I don't know, years and years and years. So under a bit of pressure, we persuaded him to pick up my guitar. And he immediately, from memory, started to play incredible classical music and flamenco-style guitar. And he had not picked up a guitar for something like 10 or 15 years. And the most annoying thing about him was I also heard that he could paint. And I've met a few people over the years who say, I love painting. And I mean, I'm no expert at all, but I look at their painting and think, oh, well, it's nice if you enjoy it, but I don't think I will. And anyway, one day, a few months later, I went to his house and I looked at this thing on the wall. And I couldn't work out whether it was a painting or a photograph. It was that good. And I looked and looked and looked. And I said to him, is this a painting? And he's like, yeah, I paint a little. It also turned out that he was also a genius with cartoon work. And actually, his cartoons are quite famous and sold for quite a lot of money. And I just, how can somebody be that good at realist painting and cartoons and a genius on the guitar? I don't know. The Lord has made some interesting people. Why am I sharing these stories? There is a reason. I'm sure you have similar ones. But it's the fact that God gives some absolutely extraordinary talents to some people that ordinary people like us look and we We don't really understand them, and sometimes we'd think of them as strange or peculiar. I don't mean the word peculiar in an insulting way, but I sometimes think of them as peculiar people. I kind of think, well, how did God make somebody that good at something? We would look at them and say, well, they're not like us. This week when I was praying about today, the Lord spoke to me through a passage in the King James Bible. It's really funny, I don't read the King James Bible very much, but I don't know if you're the same. I still remember some of the passages in the King James, because when I was very young, that's what I read. And although I don't love the King James translation, it's wonderful for memorization, because the words are so much easier to remember. And the Lord reminded me of 1 Peter chapter 2, where Peter is writing to a church or group, and this is what he says. But ye are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. That's why the Lord spoke to me about this week. A peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvellous light, which in times past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but have now obtained mercy. Dearly beloved, I beseech ye, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from the fleshly lusts which war against your soul, having your conversation or your life honest amongst the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God on the day of visitation. So Peter speaks of us, all of us, as Christians, as being peculiar. How do you like that? To be called peculiar. He says you're peculiar. If you're a Christian, you're distinct, you're different, you're strange in comparison to the world. God is speaking to us as the people of God, and he says that we're a chosen generation, we're a royal priesthood, we're a holy nation, and we are a peculiar people. We are to be strange or different or unusual in respect to the people of the world. When you hear these stories of people with astonishing skill in certain areas, you might think of someone like Albert Einstein or Leonardo da Vinci. We think of them as being peculiar or special, and we sort of instinctively know that they're maybe 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100,000. They're special. We say to ourselves, well, there are not many people like that. But Peter says every single Christian can be one of those peculiar people who are completely different to the world around them. That's what he says. He doesn't say you're 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000. He says every Christian has a calling to be distinct, different, and peculiar to the world around them. We are to be totally different. The Holy Spirit in you desires to transform you to such an extent that you are nothing like the world that we live in. That's what the Lord wants to do in you. He says that we're to stand out from the world, that we are to be very different. We're not supposed to try and be like them. We're supposed to be totally different. I mean, not in the sense that we try to be weird and awkward, but the Lord, the Spirit in us, calls us to be completely different. And it says that our difference or our distinctiveness in the way that we live, this is what he says. It says it shows forth his praise. It speaks of him. It glorifies him. I wonder how it makes you feel to be called peculiar and different, or probably in modern language we might use the word weird. But Paul says that's who you are. Peter says that's who you are. As I was praying about this, I felt the Lord show me a few distinctions that I wanted to share with you, ways in which we are to be peculiar in respect to the world. I don't know about you, but from time to time as a Christian, there's periods of time when I feel a little stuck in my walk with the Lord. I think we all do, in the sense that I'm sure you've all been there. There's times when you look and you think, well, am I growing at all? Has anything really changed in my heart, in my life, in my love for the Lord in the last 6 months or year? You wonder what's changed, if anything. I was thinking it's a little bit like sometimes when you have plants in the garden, there comes a time when the kind of branches harden and it's like no growth takes place. It's not dead, but there's just no growth. It happens, especially when you're as bad at gardening as me. And sometimes if you want a plant to grow again, if you want to see, the fruit or the beauty of the flowers, you literally have to prune that plant right back. You have to attack it, for something to change in order for it to become healthy. And in the life of a Christian, there are times when we look and we don't really see any significant growth in us, but there are things that we can do to promote growth and healthiness. And today I felt the Lord wanted me just to share a few specific things with you that relate to this, ways in which we can be distinctive as followers of Jesus, and they're things that promote healthy growth. Let me give you a little background to what I felt the Lord speaking to me about. I'm using kind of lots of pictures and analogies today, but I'm just trying to be helpful. The last few months, it's come to an end sadly, but the last few months, Sam and I have been watching this great TV series. Don't know whether any of you have seen it. It's called Continuum, and it's kind of slightly sci-fi-ish, but that's not really what it's about. But essentially, there's a police officer from the year 2077, and she has been sent back in time, about 60 years, and she is stuck in the past. And she is trying desperately to get back to her true home, where she has a young son, and where she has a husband and family. And much of the series is about her sheer frustration about trying to get back, knowing that her true home is somewhere else. And she found it really difficult being motivated every day because she was missing her home. She was from a different place, she was from a different time, she spoke differently, thought differently. Everything was different about her, and every day was a battle. She was just desperate to get home, and she had a longing in her heart, and the main thing was that she couldn't explain to anyone else what was going on because no one else could possibly understand what was going on in her heart. And as I've been watching this series, I thought, wow, to a large extent, that's what it's like to be a Christian. Have you ever been in a place where you're trying to talk to someone about your faith and you thought, well, they can't really understand what I'm talking about because they don't yet know Jesus? It's not being critical, but the Bible says that spiritual things are spiritually discerned. We are different, and sometimes people just don't get it. Let me share some words from Hebrews chapter 11. This is one of the passages that's really, I think, important. In Hebrews 11, the writer discusses the different heroes of the faith. If you remember, it's the passage where he lists all these different heroes, men and women from the past who have been heroes of the faith, people like Moses, people like Abraham. And this is what he says about them in verse 13. And listen to this, it's really interesting. He says, all these people, all of these heroes of the faith, they were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on the earth. Aliens, peculiar people. They weren't at home where they were. They didn't feel at home. And he says, people who say such things show that they're looking for a country of their own. In other words, they're looking for a home. If they'd been thinking of the country they'd left, in other words, where they came from, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. One of the distinctive characteristics of a Christian is that they recognize that they are foreigners and strangers in this world. I don't know whether you ever think about yourself by that, but the writer says that one of the distinct characteristics of a Christian is that they do not feel at home where they live. They're an alien, they're a stranger. They understand that this is not their home. Like they're waiting on something better and more important. And it's like their starting point for all their thinking, their frame of reference is that they are a stranger and an alien in this world. This is what the writer says is a fundamental part of following Jesus. You recognize that you are a stranger here. Now, as a human being born into this world, in one sense, this is the only home, we have ever known. It's not surprising that we can easily just fit in and settle down. That's what's natural. That's what comes most naturally. But the writer says that these heroes of the faith, they were not like that. They didn't settle down and fit in. They didn't even feel at home. They felt like they were aliens and strangers. They didn't feel like the people around them. They didn't think the way as the same people around them. They didn't have the same values as the people around them. They didn't even expect people around them to really understand where they're coming from. They were aliens and strangers. And the writer says, if you really love Jesus, this is something that is going to be true of you. You're not going to quite fit in here. This is not your home. The writer says these heroes of the faith were not like the people of the world. And he even says, and notice this, if you look carefully, he says, the way that they spoke shows us that they were looking for a country of their own, a different place. And then if there were any doubt at all about what he meant, he says that they were looking for a heavenly home. Earth was not their home. So if you're a Christian, the writer says, the earth is not your home. Don't feel at home here. I don't know whether you feel that way, but I think the writer would say it'd be great if you did. We're looking for a different place. And somehow, and this is a miracle, this is not natural, but somehow these heroes of the faith, these people who seem to succeed to a great extent in their walk with the Lord, they managed not to live as if this was their home or their ultimate destination. Somehow they escaped what's most natural and managed to live as aliens and strangers on the earth. The earth was not their home, and if you love Jesus, the earth is not your home. And I would put it like this. I think that the breakthrough moment for Christians is the thing that can change your life is the moment you get this. The moment that you realize that the earth really isn't your home is the moment that God just can break into your life and change so much about you, because it affects everything about how you think and what you do with everything you have. The breakthrough moment for many Christians is that point of realization when they say, you know what, I am an alien and a stranger in this world. Not everyone gets to that point, but it can be a true point of breakthrough. So there is an appropriate longing for our heavenly home for Christians. It's okay to long for your heavenly home. It's a good thing. This longing for our heavenly home manifests itself in certain peculiar ways, or ways that make you distinct from the world around you, when you realize that you're an alien and a stranger, and that you know that you're just passing through on your way to somewhere much more important, your eternal home. And I was thinking about it in this way. What does that look like practically? We have many wonderful students come and stay with us. We love having them stay with us. But when they come, they basically carry a suitcase or two. They have a few clothes. maybe a laptop, maybe a phone, but they don't live as others do who live in this area because it's not their home. They're here for 6 months or a year and they just live differently because of that. And I think that's a picture of what it looks like to recognize that the earth is not your home. It just looks totally different. You look completely different. And the writer of the Hebrews says that that's the way the heroes of the faith lived. Let me give a couple of examples of what this might look like. The first, I think, is always being ready to go when God says go. There is this temptation to always get comfortable where we are. It's natural, completely natural. I was thinking this week about when Sam and I first got married. I think the expression they use is nesting. Do you say that in the States? You want matching plates, matching cups, matching bowls. You fill your kitchen up with kitchen gadgets that you're never going to use. It's okay. It's part of getting married. It's fun. It's what you do. I remember when we bought our first couch. It seemed like such a grown-up thing to do. It was all exciting going to the shop and buying a couch. I was like, wow, we're grown up. This is amazing. Stuff like that. It's kind of fun. It's okay. Nothing wrong with it. But as we've been following Jesus for a while now, that desire, to a great extent, has diminished. We haven't been married nearly as long as some of you, but in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, our 20th anniversary comes up, which seems like a big deal for us. It's not that we don't like nice things. Everybody does, but we've found that the things that we accumulate get in the way, very much get in the way of being ready to go whenever God says go. Of being able to be obedient. It's like a lead weight around your feet when God just tells you to go and do something. The stuff we have causes us to be less and less like the heroes of the faith, basically, who lived and thought as if they knew that they were on their way to a New Jerusalem. In fact, if I'm really honest, nowadays not that we always do very well at it, but we have a perpetual desire to have less and less and less in our home. We're like, we don't want all this stuff. It's just in the way of following Jesus. We want to live lightly so that we can do whatever God says, whenever God says. And I was thinking you'd probably call it an alien mindset, having an alien mindset, just being ready to do whatever the Lord calls you to do at any time. And I think the call of God is not to be too comfortable. It's to live as an alien and stranger on the earth. I think this is a really positive way of following Jesus. Many people would say, very genuinely and really meaning it, I would be willing to do whatever the Lord said. Whatever the Lord called me to do, I would be willing to go. I would be willing to do. But the truth is, the more you have, the harder it is. It's definitely true. So that's having an alien mindset. And then the thing related to that is this characteristic of what I think of as living lightly, which I think was exemplified by Abraham. Let me just read some verses from Hebrews 11:8. This is what it says about Abraham. Hebrews 11:8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place that he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went. I love this verse. It's one of my favorite verses in the Bible. It says, even though he did not know where he was going. It's one thing to be called by the Lord to do something that you find tough. It's a whole other thing to set out without even knowing where you're going. But that's what Abraham did. He set out having no idea where he was going, other than the Lord had told him to go. It says, by faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country, He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. And the writer says that there are essentially two stages to Abraham's journey. The first stage was his willingness to get up and to go, to move to a promised land, even though he didn't know where it was. That was the first stage. But in a sense, the writer seems to say that his move to the promised land was actually only a prophetic picture of the second stage, which was his move to the New Jerusalem, the true promised land. And Abraham really exemplifies the willingness to go wherever God tells you to go, whenever he tells you to go. It's excuse me, it's an outward sign of a heart attitude. The willingness to go is an outward sign of a heart attitude that just says, I'm yours, Lord. Whatever you want, I'm yours. I'll do with my life whatever you want me to do. I'll live wherever you want me to live. I'll live however you want me to live. And this willingness is peculiar. It's not common. It's not normal. It's not natural, I should say. But it is the calling of the Christian, I think. I think it's pretty clear that's what he's talking about. And it bears the fruit of passion for Jesus. The simpler your life, the more passion you can have for Jesus. The next way I felt that the Lord says that we should be peculiar, and this is an interesting one, is that we should not think that anything that we might do is limited or controlled by our own resources. We should not think that anything the Lord might call us to do is limited by our own resources, whether they be money, skills, academic background, nationality, freedom to travel, excuse me, no family setting. Nothing is a barrier to what God wants to do and what God is willing to do through our lives. Our calling in general, so this is the calling of every Christian. God, gives us specific things, but the general calling of every Christian is not to simply settle down and live a quiet life until we die. That is not the calling of a Christian in any way. We have a calling to be used by God for his glory. Like, our main reason for living is for glorifying Jesus. That's the primary purpose of our life. I don't know whether you think about it like that, but you could say that's the reason you're alive. If you love Jesus, that's the reason. First and foremost. You might think of all kinds of secondary things, but you exist for God's glory. And we have a calling to be used for God's glory, and it takes the shape of things like bringing his kingdom, taking the gospel, leading people to know him. Every one of us is supposed to live a full life of faith where you get to be used by the Lord. He doesn't call a handful to do that, 1 in every 10 or 1 in every 50 Christians. It's every Christian. That's your calling. It's the reason you're alive. I wanted to read a little passage which we always associate with Christmas. It's Luke chapter 2, starting at verse 26. Listen to this. It says, "Now in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary, and having come in, the angel said to her, 'Rejoice, highly favored one, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women.' But when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying and considered what manner of greeting this might be. Then the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord will give him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." Then Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I do not know a man?" And the angel answered and said to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the highest will overshadow you. Therefore also that Holy One who is to be born will be called the Son of God. Now indeed Elizabeth, your relative, has also conceived a son in her old age, and this is now the 6th month for her who was called barren. For with God nothing will be impossible." And then Mary said, "Behold, the maidservant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." And the angel departed from her. As I read this passage on Wednesday or Thursday, it immediately reminded me, I kind of laughed, but it immediately reminded me of Alice in Wonderland. Don't know whether you remember this bit, but Alice said, "There's no use trying. People can't believe impossible things." And then the Queen said, "I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I did it for half an hour a day. Sometimes I believed as much as 6 impossible things before breakfast." For us as Christians, we're not trying to make ourselves illogically and irrationally believe impossible things, trying to hold on to things and convince ourselves that they're true, even though we know full well that they're not. But there is something in us that says, should say, because of God, nothing is impossible. Nothing. With Mary, what she was told by the angel, were it not for God, would be utterly ridiculous. Would it not? Crazy. There's nothing rational or logical or realistic to think that it might be true. And in a worldly sense, she was just an insignificant young woman who no one had ever heard of. She was unmarried. She had no resources. She had no skills. She had no experience or background or prominence of any kind. But when the Lord came, or when the Lord sent an angel, all that meant nothing. All that just went out of the window. Doesn't mean anything at all. As the angel said to her, "For with God, nothing will be impossible for you." And Mary had the faith to say, "Let it be according to your word." She kind of believed it. Not sure how much, but I think she kind of did, To be practical, I'm always talking to you about India, but I remember when the Lord first called us to go to India, we did not think that we had the resources to go to India. We didn't really have much in the way of relevant experience. We didn't have the relationship or the contacts with ministries in India. We didn't have an understanding of who might go with us to help us. Logically, every single practical consideration mitigated against what we felt the Lord was saying. It was utterly unrealistic in every way. It's easy to look back now and see how it happened, but at the time it just seemed crazy. At the time God spoke to us, Sam was unable to walk and permanently in a wheelchair. She also, don't mind me saying, she also had a profound intolerance to lentils, the one thing that they ate every single day, often twice a day. We started to pray and fast, and the first evening that we told our friends that we felt God was calling us to go to India, as soon as we finished speaking to them, they said, okay, we'll put our house up for sale in the morning, we'll come with you. I mean, immediately. That was the first practical consideration solved within a few hours. After fasting and prayer, God healed Sam and got her out of a wheelchair. Second practical consideration out of the way. Not only that, he also completely healed her from a lentil intolerance to the extent that she was able to eat them every single day in India, and she did. It was truly miraculous. For some reason, when we came back, he gave her it back again. I don't know about that. Don't understand that. But believe me, it was a miracle. The same thing happened with every single objection that we had to going. Every single one just fell away. None of the objections were of any relevance when God said to go, because he opened every single door at the right time. As soon as we were willing to go, he opened all of the doors. He also miraculously led us to the place we were going through, incredible supernatural signs. I could talk about all of these things, but my point is this. I think that most of us are, if we're really honest, absolutely convinced that our life situation or our financial situation or our marriage or the age of our children or our lack of skills or experience or our current age, I could list 100 things, stand in the way of us being used by God in exciting ways. I've heard so many people say, I'd love to go on the mission field, but, or I would love to serve in the Lord, I'd love to serve the Lord in this way, but, or God's put this ministry on my heart, but, it's either because of my husband, or because of my bank balance, or because, my children are halfway between this exam and that exam. I've heard hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things like that. But honestly, it's not true. It just isn't. Two of my greatest heroes were a couple of old women I heard about a few years back. I'm sure I mentioned them to you before. But these two crazy women are well into their 80s. And they're Bible smugglers. They smuggle the Bible into places where you can't have Bibles. And here's the thing. The very thing that most people would say is the reason they can't do it is the reason they can do it. Like most people would say, how can two women of in their late 80s be Bible smugglers? Of course they can't. It's the very reason they do it. Because nobody suspects them. It's, there is nothing in our lives that stands in the way of God using us for his kingdom. There just isn't. There just isn't. He wants to use all of us without exception for his glory, to see people come to know him, to use our time and our resources for his glory. That's our calling. And for the people of the world, this is a generalization, it's not always true, but I think it's very much the case normally that what they think they can do is determined by what they have. The job they do is determined by their experience. The house they live in is determined by how much savings they have or how much they earn. The country they live in is generally determined by what country they were born in. That's the way they think, and it's logical, it's natural. But those things are not true of a Christian. They're not. as we read, in Mark's Gospel, with God, nothing will be impossible for you. God could open any door, any opportunity, any time, and much of it comes through prayer or prayer and fasting. It is not true that you are limited by your work situation, your job situation, your family situation, your financial situation. It's not true. Any one of us can be used by God in ways that please and glorify him and build his kingdom. If God can create the world and hold it all in his hands, why would you think that anything is too hard for him? It's kind of ridiculous, to think that way when we know who God is and what he's like. I wanted to finish in this way. On Friday night, helpful if I looked at my notes occasionally. On Friday night, Sam and I watched, this is a clip from it, a picture from it, a new movie called Dunkirk. I think it came out last year. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It's a great movie. I'd certainly recommend it. And it was about the evacuation of 198,000 British soldiers and 140,000 French and Belgian soldiers from the French coast starting on May the 26th, 1940, when they were completely surrounded by German artillery. The evacuation took 9 days, and it was a completely miraculous undertaking. And I don't mean miraculous in purely human terms, as if it was incredible, but I mean miraculous because I think it was the Lord. I think it's pretty clear. On the 26th, the king at the time, King George, called the whole nation to a national day of prayer, asking the whole nation to turn back to God in a spirit of repentance and to plead for God's help in rescuing these soldiers. And what happened is that as soon as they prayed, a violent storm rose up, grounding almost the entire German Air Force. There were some planes coming from further away who could fly in, but it kind of grounded 98% of the German aeroplanes. And then what happened on the English Channel was that this truly miraculous calm settled on the sea. I can't remember the distance, and I forgot to look, but it's something like 35 miles across the sea. And even the smallest boats, I think the smallest was 15 feet, that's a dinghy, were able to cross and rescue soldiers. 860 boats set out from England, 860. Some of them like a tiny little sailing boat, some of them fishing vessels, some of them ferries, some of them ships, but some of them were absolutely tiny. I think the smallest one just rescued 5 people. And everyone was rescued. Yeah. It was crazy. Now, there were some people who died, from bombing and things like that, but one of the things that really impressed me during the film, obviously they're stories, but there were a whole bunch of people who basically set out in these boats into a situation that, humanly speaking, was crazy. Would you set out in a 15-foot boat 35, 40 miles at sea? You would expect to die. With the pilots, you probably remember the Spitfire was the main kind of English aeroplane at the time. These aeroplanes would set out across the channel. They would spend a small amount of time engaging the enemy in the air, and then they would immediately fly back to make sure that they had enough fuel to return safely. Otherwise, obviously, they would die. And the film focused on the life of one particular pilot who realized that basically there was this great big line of boats coming backwards and forwards that were trying to be bombed. And this pilot just decided that he was saving so many lives that he would not make sure he had enough fuel to return. And he just kept flying and flying and flying and chasing down the enemy until he ran out of fuel. And at which point he managed to glide to a halt on the beach, knowing full well that he would immediately be arrested by the Germans and spend life in prison and probably die. And I know Sam and I were, after we were watching this film, we said, isn't it interesting that in war, sometimes people are prepared to sacrifice everything. And it's kind of interesting how the most ordinary people suddenly become extraordinary. I know we look back at these people, we read about the heroes, but we don't really think about the fact that actually they were just completely ordinary people the day before. And it was being in the situation of war that allowed them to suddenly become extraordinary, to do extraordinary things, to be completely selfless. And I think that for us as Christians, we need to recognize that we are actually in a war. We're in a spiritual battle. And the spiritual battle is much longer even than the Second World War, as horrific as it was. And some of us who are very ordinary people can actually be used by God in extraordinary ways that we wouldn't have dreamed would be possible. I don't know why sometimes as people in the world, and they're able to commit themselves incredibly passionately to the most minor of causes. Sometimes when I see people on Facebook, it seems like they've devoted their whole life to campaigning for a relatively minor social issue. But what about us being absolutely committed, like some of these heroes were, whether it be at Dunkirk or whether it be some of these heroes of the faith? How about some of us choosing to live peculiar lives where we don't treat this as our home, where we realize that we're in a war and where we're willing to give absolutely everything, even if it costs us, for God's glory, because that is the sole reason that we're alive. Once we know Jesus, that's our purpose. Nothing is impossible for those who love God. That's what I wanted to share with you guys today. Amen. Amen.